Before we begin, it is my sad duty to report a major character death, that of my beard. At the bullying of friends, strangers, and Torchwood/Sarah Jane Adventures writer Joseph Lidster, it's been shaved. I'm very unhappy about this, and I want you to be unhappy about it too. Hello, I continue to be Kevin, or Script Scribbles, back at it again with the Doctor Who coverage of Series 11. Today we are covering Episode 2, The Ghost Monument, written by Chris Chibnall. Overall, this episode is best understood as a companion piece to the opener, which is to say, it's designed to continue to introduce series elements. What we get is, of course, the episode being made about the absence of the TARDIS and reintroducing that major element of the show's mythos. In addition to making itself about reclaiming that last big piece, we finally get the first glimpse at the new title sequence, which is a great way of announcing to the audience, this is Doctor Who. The ingredients are back in play and we are ready to go. This episode begins with a great sense of danger, which I ranted about very enthusiastically in my previous video. We get thrust into the adventure immediately with a Hitchhiker's Guide-esque opening of people being picked up in space against all odds. But rather than have that just be a convenient resolution, it just continues to ratchet up the drama with a sequence of two ships crashing. And I love the way the crew is separated in this. We get two sets of characters with Epso, the Doctor, and Yaz offset against Graham, Angstrom, and Ryan, which makes for a compelling different character angle. The Graham and Ryan duo is quickly proving to be a favorite of mine. Their responses to grief are entirely in different directions than I would have expected, with Ryan becoming a bit surlier and a bit more difficult to reach, and Graham becoming a very optimistic and wonder-filled person as a result of trying to live up to the standard Grace set him. I love that. Bradley Walsh is absolutely sparkling in this episode, and that's entirely down to a character decision I wasn't expecting Chris Chibnall to make, but I'm so happy he did. More technically spectacular, though, is the side of the action going to Epso, the Doctor, and Yaz, shot entirely in long takes by Mark Tonderai, the director. This is such a great choice to visually distinguish it from the status quo going on in Angstrom's ship with the others, because it means just looking at it you have a different visual style. And the way it's shot is extremely claustrophobic. We're moving about the space of the ship, but never outside of it. So many other eras of Doctor Who would have given you a establishing exterior shot, and we don't get that. It is outright denied to us. This makes it really interesting in comparison to the more controlled landing by Angstrom with Graham and Ryan. The dual structure really makes up the basic bones of this episode. Epso and Angstrom contrast in ideologies, in emotions, and even in gender.
You think the whole universe is out to get you?
How's your family, Angstrom?
Epso is a piece of work. He's raised to value self-preservation, as we get in his traumatic sob story that he doesn't seem to realize is as messed up as it is.
Shattered that ankle, and she stood over me and she said, now you've learned. You can never trust anyone.
He feels like a bit of a political allegory, as an analog to conservatism.
Don't take him personally. He treats everyone like this.
And he's raised to value tradition as well.
Well, this thing should be on Antiques Roadshow.
And is willing to put that value above his life until the Doctor slaps sense into him.
She's the envy of millions.
Really?
Yes. People have written songs about her.
They'll be writing operas about our pointlessness if we don't take drastic action right now.
And of course, he values expensive luxury. He parades the cigar around like crazy to the point where, yes, it's extremely obvious plot establishment and should have been more subtle, but it also becomes sort of a insanely camp character trait.
You want a sniff?
On the other hand, we have Angstrom, who is very much positioned in a left-wing victim sort of position. She is essentially a survivor of a holocaust of her people.
Albar is being systematically cleansed.
And, of course, we know she's a woman who likes girls.
You know the stanza too?
My wife died because of that.
Mine too.
Angstrom also connects really nicely to the team of Graham and Ryan as a result of the shared fridging angst. For all my issues with building this on fridging, and I mean, come on guys, use a different trope. It's not that hard. It's a really nice way of tying the reality of this first trip to the emotional realities of the companions. And that is a wonderful thing because The episode doesn't stick with the really interesting structural gimmick, but works as quickly as possible to put the whole gang back together by 10 minutes in. Which means most of the episode is still defined by this new doctor taking command of everything. And of course we want to see the new woman doctor be in command, but it means they don't get as defined, and we just get more re-establishing of similar character beats. Particularly as of late with characters like Amy, Donna, Clara. Their first trips in the TARDIS said a lot about who they were as people and how their agencies determined the show. Donna, for example, demanding that the Doctor save people regardless of the rules, or Clara having to put her own story in the place of the Doctor's and overriding it because hers was a better story. And then you have Amy, who is willing to call the Doctor's own traumas from the perspective of having hers, and is able to help the Doctor make a better moral decision than he would have otherwise. Those are all really fantastic beats, and we get nothing of the sort here, which is kind of disappointing. I would have liked to see that, and I would have liked to get to know who this TARDIS team is better. In comparison to all those emotional conclusions, this episode ends in the Doctor blowing up a cigar. So what do we get of this episode if not a story about introducing the companions? I mean, of course it's a story about reintroducing the TARDIS, but that is a element that gets held off naturally till the end, where it should be. So in the meantime, we get what is ostensibly a narrative about the competing Epzo and Angstrom, because they get more of the development than the companions do. So what does their arc say? If we're to read Angstrom as a more left-wing victim and Epzo as a traumatized conservative out for himself, what does it mean if they have this story? Well, criticism first, they're not the best developed. Epzo is a bit of a straw man if he is to be read as allegory. He's not very deep, he's never once given much backing to his values, and he gets beaten up for it repeatedly. Whereas Angstrom, she's nice, and you like her, but there's not really anything else to her. Nothing challenged, nothing learned. And I say this as a very, very left-wing guy, like, this is a problem. It's all well and good to have politics in a story, but you need to make them feel lived in and not really preachy allegory. But despite these undercooked elements, this allegory is the sort of story Doctor Who should be telling. I mean, at first glance, it seems a bit centrist. The leftist and the right-wing person, they learn to work together and they get to earn the reward together, and that's all great. But the thing is, these values are not treated as equal lessons to the two sides. Angstrom more or less gets the idea, but just needs to be encouraged to trust a bit more. Whereas Epzo, he's the one that really needs to learn. He's the one that gets shot out for it. He's the one who nearly gets strangled. He's the one who's the problem. So if there's an allegory about working together in this episode, it's about how the right wing would need to be the ones to put aside thinking they're the most important people in the universe. And the Doctor, for her part, gets a fantastic speech about that.
And as hard as it is for you to understand, you are not the only life form in this universe. Some of us feel a duty to others who might be in trouble. So fix your wound, take one of your heroic naps, and we'll wake you when we leave, if you're lucky.
That really means a lot in the current political climate and in the current state of the show. And if the episode is to be read as a political allegory, then it's to be read as one where caring for each other, supporting each other, solidarity, a word which Graham mentioned when I was quite happy to hear.
Show a bit of solidarity.
Those are all progressive traits, and that is what Doctor Who is advocating. That I have a lot of admiration for. I will not complain about a Doctor Who episode seeking to do that. I don't like the execution entirely, but those are good values to have. So what does that do to the plot? Well, as a race narrative, it's actually kind of lacking because there isn't much racing. The Doctor crashes into this story, and the tension totally changes. They deal with all three deadly threats as a unit. They sail across the water together, the killer blankets get blown up in one go, and the robots all get taken down by the EMP by the Doctor. So 2 of 3 are defeated by the Doctor, really, and that means we don't really get much of a sense of competition from Angstrom and Epzo. The only moment of particular peril for any character is when Epzo gets shot. He's just kind of fine afterwards, like, dude's been shot in, like, the neck collarbone area, and after sleeping it off, it's never mentioned. It's just onto the killer blankets, and that means this episode is very low stakes for a death race in which we're told
4,000 entered, 2 are left.
They must not have been very good at surviving if this is all it takes. Show don't tell is a pretty trite expression, and I'm not one to pull it out, but if this is going to be a death race in which a bunch of people die, I'd have liked to see some of that, and to make these threats feel a bit more creepy. That was what I loved about the last episode, the way it really developed the people it killed to make the threat seem more present, even though, oddly, Tim Shaw was less of a threat to me than these blankets, which do nothing. As a result, I think it's worth asking what the point of putting Doctor Who in a death race is. I think the takeaway is that by dropping any Doctor into this sort of scenario, it stops becoming a death race because the Doctor will not stand for that kind of thing. Mind, if she'd made the suggestion about just taking the reward together back when there were thousands of racers, that wouldn't have worked, because that's thousands of people. They can't really all split this thing and still come out well ahead. And they're not going to agree to either. It's just going to make someone mad, and someone's not going to listen, and they're going to go for it. So, while it's a neat little solution with allegorical meaning, it doesn't really hold up if you start digging in the corners. So if it's going for the progressive angle, and I really think it is, it doesn't land. Then we have the antagonist behind this race, Ilum, who's even more of a straw man than Epso. He's rich, he's selfish, he clearly enjoys watching people die for his entertainment, and that's about all we learn, and he's pretty easy to deal with when all is said and done. I can forgive that with the allegorical nature of this story. It's not designed to be deep in character, which, again, I'm not sure why that's the first trip, but it holds up well enough on its own terms, even though, like I've said, I've got plenty of nitpicks. What I can't forgive about the character of Ilum is the exoticist orientalism in the aesthetics.
All right, Corporal Bell.
For those unfamiliar with the critical theory of Orientalism, it comes from a book by Edward Said called Orientalism. And the basic concept is that in Western society, we conflate scientific study of the East with this sort of exoticized aesthetic, where, in essence, Western study of the East defines it to justify Western complexes of superiority, colonialism, and calling the others barbarians.
Yes, as I was saying, they're a mysterious lot, the Chinese. Enigmatic. I never got nowhere near to understanding them. And I was brought up in China.
The term the other is foundational to this, as something defined against the Western self. We know who we are as a culture because we aren't those weird foreigners. In essence, foreigners are the aliens of history, and similar forces apply to storytelling. Arabian Nights, for example, which we all know quite well, or at least know elements of, like Aladdin. Aladdin is not an Arabian story. It was added in by Western translators who realized the popularity of the original Arabian Nights stories and added a bunch. For example, Aladdin, Alibaba, etc. Those are Western stories using an exotic aesthetic to seem magical and alien. The exoticized other isn't just a colonizing thing, it's done because we think, as Westerners, that the barbarians are actually kind of tight. We like to see the magic in the alien. We just don't think they're proper people. The thing is, we don't just present the other racialized magic onto real-life cultures. We do it with aliens. For example, Star Wars recently, there was a lot of controversy in the early 2000s over characters like Jar Jar Binks and Newt Gunray, who were respectively black minstrel caricature and Thai accent, for some reason, Orientalism. But Doctor Who also does this. There is, for example, the Celestial Toymaker, and Celestial, for those who don't know, is an old slur against Chinese people. What the Celestial Toymaker does is it uses a racist cliche of Chinese people to create some sort of magical eldritch being to toy with the Doctor. Read Elizabeth Sandifer's essay if you want more on the nature of that, because it's really a foundational piece of Doctor Who criticism. But it's more insidious than that. There are, for example, the Draconians, who are, quite unsubtly, Japanese. And when Doctor Who continues to expand on them, you get some really horrific pieces of sci-fi racism, such as the Big Finish audio paper cuts, where you get, of course, flying pagodas and killer origami because Japan in space. There is no way we should have this stuff as recently as 2009, and hell, even Stephen Moffat and Russell T Davies get in on it. The planet of Shan Shen from Turn Left, the sort of set dressing where the Doctor and Donna have a bit of fun and Donna gets attacked by a weird fortune teller, that's pretty textbook as a case of using Orientalist aesthetics to create a sense of the alien. I mean, it's basically right out of Firefly, which, yes, Orientalism. And more recently, we got monsters like the monks from the Moffat era, which are based aesthetically by Peter Harness on Tibetan mummies, and then paired off with Egyptian pyramids for some reason, because stuff looks spacey to us for some goddamn reason, because it's kind of racist. So while having an evil man of color in these weird Orientalist aesthetics isn't the worst thing Doctor Who's ever done, and it's still iffy, it's still problematic, and I'm still gonna call it. And I realized that I'm a white guy, I can only say so much about this, but this is an ongoing problem in media, and I am going to call it as it is. I would love to hear what episode 6 writer Vinay Patel has to say about this, but for now we get generically alien Asia. While on the topic of the visual storytelling, I have to say my opinions on the direction and general camera work and presentation are actually kind of mixed. This episode has been quite rightly praised for how visually impressive it looks. The effects are gorgeous, the sets are gorgeous, the locations are stunning, but there's points of strain. The color can vary greatly. We get times where we cut from one angle to another and the color correction is totally different. The lighting varies. We get some places where faces are really cast in shadow with some really ugly lighting where you'd have thought they'd get some diffusion in to tone it down, but you can see the cameras are really struggling to take advantage of the dynamic range of the lighting. There's numerous shots in which subjects, while framed perfectly within the rule of thirds, where you have like subject in 1/3, 2/3 of other parts of the frame, rather than looking into the dead space of the frame, which is what you usually get, they're looking right off to the side, and that is a really weird camera shooting strategy I'm not entirely sure I like. But weirdest of all is the framing. I praised the long take earlier for being really quite good, but it cuts off the side of Jodie Whittaker's head at one point. And we get a lot of shots like that where people don't entirely fit into their frame and it's just left in the episode. I'm sure it's stylistic, it looks intentional with how much it happens, but it looks a bit sloppy. That's a shame though, because I like a lot of the conscious creative decisions in this episode. There's two particular shots that did more for me than anything else. First of all, in the whole long take episode crash sequence, I loved that not only did we not go to any exterior shots, we got action like the jettisoning of half the ship shot from the inside, where we just see it flying away into space through the window. I mean, that had to be a pretty fancy effect shot, I would have thought, but it doesn't celebrate the effects. They're very subtle and kept in the background. And then the other shot that was really, really hilarious was during the Call of Duty joke, when Ryan goes running out with the gun. It is shot exactly like a first-person shooter. Like, compare that to, say, a camera angle from Halo. Identical. That's brilliant. Great. And that ultimately brings us back into the role of companions in this episode. Ryan's lesson with guns is easily the biggest beat, and I've seen some really mixed opinions about it.
Guns, never use them.
For me, the limitations of that beat were more due to the fact that the Doctor's alternative didn't feel as well developed as it could have. That sort of is my big issue with a lot of this episode. I like what it's trying to say, but it doesn't necessarily say it in the most nuanced or detailed way. Having her make an electromagnetic pulse to destroy the robots instead of a gun, sure, that's clever, but you don't really get a sense of her having to do much cleverness to make it.
The answer was on the floor, you just reached for the wrong thing.
The Doctor just finds an electromagnetic pulse on the ground and goes, bonk, woom. I saved the day because I'm so clever and just found something on the ground. And that doesn't really feel like a satisfying answer to why you shouldn't use guns. Despite that beat, Graham and Ryan continue to be handled really well. I loved how Ryan's dyspraxia continues to be a recurring feature because, of course, it's a part of him. We get the very nice beat where the Doctor tells him how well he's doing just to encourage him to climb the ladder.
Think what you've gone through to be here, and you're still going. I'm proper impressed.
But more than that, I really like the beat where Ryan, when running from the spaceship crashing, not only is he the first to run from Epso's spaceship, he's also the only one to stumble. In fact, the other characters only stumble trying to pick him up to keep going. It's never once said to be as a result of his dyspraxia, but you know it is because that's part of who he is, and that's a really nice subtle choice That shows there is going to be some really low-key dedication to detail with the characters. Chris Chibnall also gives a lot of credit to their working-class ingenuity and letting them solve plot points. Them working out, for example, mechanical power sources was a great little way of delivering exposition. And better than that was the Doctor quizzing Ryan.
Focus on facts about acetylene as you climb.
To develop the exposition for the final plot point. That's something that, I mean, even in the previous episode, stuff like that was handled by a big scene of people asking the Doctor what's going on. Here it's handled by the Doctor giving the companions something to think about and trusting their own cleverness. I mean, she's still the one doing the action there, but it's presented through their eyes and them being clever to solve it, and that goes a long way to making that climactic beat more meaningful for me, though I would have liked it more if the companions were responsible. Graham's new optimistic outlook, which I mentioned earlier, also feeds nicely into the climatic beat. I mean, though that didn't work for me to have the Doctor giving up because the TARDIS isn't present, I liked that he was the one to rally the team and say, that's some really nice, deft character work.
Who says we're giving up? Any of us? Really? Even you, Doc? No. Come on, we ain't having that, are we?
Nope.
Yeah.
No.
Though the Doctor's sudden whiplash of, oh no, everything's gone wrong, not so much.
No, we'll be dead within one rotation.
I mean, we as viewers know already, it's been mentioned, she even knows the TARDIS appears intermittently, and we know next week there's going to be a Rosa Parks episode, so damn it, they're going to have to time travel. They're getting the TARDIS. But it was very good for how it uses Graham's new outlook, and I like that development. And then, Yaz exists. We learn she has family, which will be developed later and I'm looking forward to. But for now, about all we learn about her is, looks like she's a fan of Steven Universe. And then, yes, there's the TARDIS, our ghost monument. I love the way Jodie Whittaker says that. It was such wonder. It's such a cute little moment of poetry. The whole handling of her finding the TARDIS again is proper iconic and the most beautifully shot portion of the episode, so some of the vistas during the robot section give it a run for its money. Not only does it have the best 2 gags this Doctor has had yet so far, including number 1, her saying,
Come to Daddy.
I mean, of course modern Doctor Who's gonna have to accept that daddy kink is a thing, but... And then the second best gag, the custard cream dispenser in the TARDIS. Apparently some people don't like it, and all I can say is, you hate joy. I'm not entirely sold on the new TARDIS set, aside from the biscuit dispenser, which is like, yes, biscuit dispensers for everything, please. Because while it looks good in some of the close-up shots, the wide pulling back to show the entire interior looks really awkward as we get outside of the crystal cage bit. And it looks disjointed. And overall, the space of the TARDIS, it looks like it's a pretty big set, but it doesn't feel very big because there's so much empty space. As for the lighting, it's very atmospheric and very spooky, but I get the feeling it's not going to work so well for domestic scenes in the TARDIS, something emphasized even more by the fact you don't get any really cozy spaces to chill in. There's no chairs, there's not even any sense of other rooms. So it'll be interesting to see how they move on with it. It took a while for them to learn how to decorate and shoot the 12th Doctor's TARDIS, so I'm optimistic for what they do with this set. And that sort of sums up the episode, really. I don't quite like it, but I'm optimistic for what they could do with the ingredients. It's a learning curve. It's not a typical first trip episode, and there's not really the emotional depth and character-defining agency that we would get typically. There's something that feels distinctly scattered and lackluster to the plotting and the emotional development. But it still feels like we could be in for something special as this era picks up. And I'm really looking forward to that. I do believe still, despite being somewhat disappointed by both of these episodes, that there is amazing things around the corner, and I can't wait to see how they develop. Beyond that, on one final critical note, I think it's important to mention just how different the pacing of this episode is in comparison to past eras. I was highlighting it for not having the same sort of emotional development and focus on the companions defining it, but that's also from a differently written type of television than this era is. In the Moffat era and the Russell T Davies era, we very much had episodic beats of development. Yes, characters would be consistent and grow across series, but they would reach big epiphanies within the space of individual episodes. The most extreme example of this is Asylum of the Daleks, which builds upon a trauma plot that was a deep part of Amy's character from the beginning.
I understand. Really. I do.
Asylum of the Daleks builds off that with the divorce plot, but the divorce itself is a purely episodic issue, introduced within the episode and solved within the episode. And I really like it. I get a lot out of it because I really identify with Amy Pond's character, but I understand why people don't. This is sort of the polar opposite. What we get here is pacing that's more akin to Game of Thrones or Stranger Things shows, which Chris Chibnall is sort of outright trying to compete with. We get little vignettes of character that could build to somewhere in future episodes, but don't go anywhere within the space of this one. It kind of clashes to me because unlike those other shows, we're not getting a serialized plot. We're getting individual plots with serialized character. The two elements sort of tug at each other. We get character beats that are placed as though we're watching this as a serial, but we get a plot that is, not the best plot and treats itself as though it's the main focus of this episode. It's awkward, and it also means we can't really judge either episode that's aired so far without a fuller picture of where the character arcs are going. Already, I feel differently with regards to how Graham and Ryan were presented in The Woman Who Fell to Earth than I did at the time. Their arcs have become more clear, and they're developing in directions I find quite interesting. We're really having to learn new critical tools to approach this new era, and that's really interesting, but it's also really frustrating. On the bright side, as far as episodic plots go, the historicals this year look really good. We'll see you next week. See you then.